Touch. Taste.
Look.
Smell. Tree.
Bird. Bell. Touch.
Taste.
Look.
Smell.
Tree.
Fish.
Bird.
Bell. So do as the poet says and listen.
And listen.
And listen. And listen. And listen.
And listen.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here on day 3 of Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival 2023. This is the 34th edition of the festival. The Glasgow Building Preservation Trust has been delivering since 1990. The festival now happens in every region in Scotland, delivered nationally by the Scottish Civic Trust. So I encourage you to get out and about and find out what else is on around you. Just go on to doorsopendays.org.uk about the other regional programmes. We are very grateful to the University of Glasgow for hosting us here at the Advanced Research Centre for the 2nd year in a row. And I'd like to say a really huge thank you to Cassie Dillon and to Zara Gladiman for all their hard work in making these events possible. The ARC is the home of collaborative research at the University of Glasgow and works to bring researchers, partners and ideas together from across the campus, the city and beyond. The ground floor where we are now is open to the public every day, so I encourage you to come up, make this part of your local commute, come and find out what's happening in this building. And there's a QR code on the wallet there on the way out, and you can register to find out what's happening in this building all year round. This weekend, the ARC is also host to Explorathon, which is a series of events celebrating all the incredible research that's happening in this building. Come along and there. We have got a really huge programme as part of Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival this year. There's about 270 listings, if you include all the digital things that are happening as well. So do go on the website. Some of the events are fully booked, but there's so much to see that you don't have to have a booking for. So look for that no booking necessary category, and also in the in-person events category, lots of those events don't need booking either. And the events at the ARC, there are still tickets for the talks which are happening tomorrow and on Friday and over the weekend as well. So look for that festival hub room. I'd like to say a really huge thank you to our funders, this Glasgow City Council and the Glasgow City Heritage Trust. And thank you to our sponsor Denton's and to all of our sponsors who make this event possible and keep it free. Thank you to our amazing volunteers who welcomed you in today, without whom the event wouldn't be possible. And thank you to Ev, our tech manager, who's going to be helping us run everything this evening. If you do feel like making a donation to help us keep this event free, you can do so by texting Doors Open to 785. Text costs £5 plus one standard rate message. And those details will be on the screen at the end of this talk. You can also make a cash donation by depositing in the buckets, or if you would like to make a donation by card, our volunteers will be able to help you do that as well. I really hope you enjoy the event this evening. We'd really love to hear what you think. And so we have a survey, which there's a QR code on a flyer that the volunteers will be able to give you on the way out. There is a £100 prize for a Glasgow local business of your choice, or one lucky winner. So I do encourage you to fill in that survey and help us make the festival better every year. Lastly, in the unlikely event of a fire alarm rather, please proceed through the doors behind you, across the foyer to the fire exits at the rear. Okay, so on to tonight's event. Tonight's talk will take a look at some of the places in Garnet Hill that are connected with Jewish refugees who came to Glasgow from Europe before, during and after the Second World War. I'm delighted to introduce Harvey Kaplan, Director of the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre, and Kerry Patterson, Manager of the Scottish Jewish Heritage Centre.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So, as you mentioned, today our talk's going to be looking at some of the places in Garnet Hill connected with Jewish refugees. Also, the Archives Centre and the Heritage Centre are both based in Garnet Hill Synagogue, and I will explain more about these organisations shortly. First of all, let's start with Garnet Hill Synagogue. So this is the Jewish community's most iconic building in Scotland, the oldest purpose-built synagogue in Scotland, opened in 1879. It's a Category A listed building for being a fine example of Victorian synagogue architecture. It's still a working synagogue and is home to the Garnet Hill Hebrew congregation. So although the synagogue's participated indoors open weekend for many years, sometimes we've had as many as 700 visitors in one day. This year, the weekend clashes with Rosh Hashanah, which is Jewish New Year. So unfortunately, we can't open to the public because the building will be open, we use for services during the weekend. So we thought we'd tell you about the refugee history of the area instead and invite you to visit us on another occasion. So before we move on to focus on the refugees and the Second World War period, we'll briefly introduce our respective organisations.
So the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre was established in 1987 and has built up a nationally significant collection relating to the Jewish experience in Scotland over the past 200 years. We collect a wide range of records of Jewish organisations in Scotland, making the collections available for education, academic research, family history, tourists and visitors of all kinds. Our collections include records of Jewish congregations, organisations in Scotland, Jewish business records, personal papers, burial records, immigration records, photographs, books, academic dissertations, ceremonial objects, textiles, artworks, oral history interviews, a whole range. These are just some items from our collections. There are leaflets here that you can get at the end about the Archives Centre and indeed about the Heritage Centre. There's also, for anybody interested, a very useful contemporary book about the Jewish experience in Scotland, which includes a chapter on the refugee period.
So the Heritage Centre opened just over 2 years ago in July 2021. And Heritage Centre was created by the Archives Centre in partnership with Garnet Hill Synagogue Preservation Trust. So this is another charity who manage the building of the synagogue, oversee the maintenance and the upkeep. And the role of the centre, the Heritage Centre, is to enable access to the building and the archive collections. So this is through public tours, school visits and other different events. So we run weekly guided tours and we welcome visits from primary and secondary level pupils who interested in studying Judaism, migration and the Second World War period. We have lots of resources such as this specially designed learning kit, which you can see on the right here. And this is one of the kits we have which tell the story of 3 refugees who came to Scotland just before the Second World War, and it uses materials from the Archives Centre. So we're really lucky to be based in such a beautiful building and also have the great resources of the Archives Centre at our disposal.
So, although were billed as talking about Jewish refugees in the Garnet Hill area, I want to give you some wider background this evening to the subject. So there's no exact figures or lists, but we estimate that maybe 2,500 Jewish refugees came to Scotland in the period around the war, so as we say, before, during and after the Second World War. To summarise, they came on the Kinder transport or through the efforts of people in the UK and Europe who committed to helping Jews escape, people such as Berta Pappenheim and Nicholas Winton. The refugees who came to Scotland included several hundred refugee doctors, and we'll talk about them later on. Holders of domestic service visas, mostly women, political refugees, Polish soldiers, a number of whom were Jewish, refugee businessmen who rebuilt their businesses in Scotland, providing employment, refugee artists, refugee rabbis and cantors, concentration camp survivors, and others. We'll look at some of their experiences in this presentation. On the slide is a cutting from the Edinburgh Evening News in 1939, showing some of the children who've arrived on the Kinder transport. So, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, thousands of Jewish and non-Jewish refugees fled from the Nazi regime to the United Kingdom and neighbouring European countries. And this influx continued all the way through the period that we're going to talk about. As early as 1930, the Jewish Echo, the Glasgow Jewish newspaper, was voicing alarm about the menace posed by the Nazis. So the newspaper article that says, "Who's Adolf Hitler?" This is from 17th of October 1930. And it says, "Who's Adolf Hitler?" The editor of the Jewish Echo said, "Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitic National Socialists have secured a sensational triumph in the German Reichstag elections. The party's anti-Semitism is well known, and German Jewry is anxiously awaiting the developments of the Hitlerist victory." So, I mean, nobody could have predicted the scale of how things developed. But across Scotland in the early 1930s, there were demonstrations and protest meetings about the plight of Jews in Germany. And you can see on the screen on the right-hand side an advertisement for a public meeting in George Square. This is in 1933, and the Lord Provost of Glasgow is presiding, and this is to protest about the persecution of Jews in Germany. And on the left-hand side, there's a poster. There was a movement to boycott German goods. A number of committees were set up in Glasgow and elsewhere in Scotland and across the UK to raise funds for the relief and rescue of Jews in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and elsewhere. So, as I mentioned, there was the move to boycott German goods. There's an article about that there, and also this shows you the scale of the fundraising. This was nationally in the UK. The Council for German Jewry was trying to raise £1 million, which in present day terms, well, in these days, it was a huge amount of money. So some of the earliest refugees who came to Scotland in the 1930s included a group of 9 or 10 Jewish children from a Jewish orphanage near Frankfurt in Germany. And in 1934, Berta Pappenheim, who was an Austrian Jewish feminist and social pioneer, brought this group of girls to the Gertrude Jacobson Jewish Orphanage in Battlefield in Glasgow. Another early refugee, not on the slide, but Otto Weiss from Vienna became the head knitwear designer for Pringle and Hoyk in 1934 and is credited for introducing the trademark twin set for women. I'm not quite sure what that is. Sorry, Kurt Hahn, in the centre of the screen, was a German educationalist from Berlin. He founded Gordonston School in Scotland in the 1930s. He also was the co-founder of the Outward Bound movement and the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. He was joined at Gordonstown by a number of Jewish and non-Jewish German teachers at the school. So from the early 30s onwards, refugees were starting to come to Scotland. These included hundreds of refugee doctors, physicians from Central Europe. In the 1930s, 1% of the German population were Jews, but 10% of the medical profession. And in Germany and Austria, under Nazi rule, Jews were not allowed to practice medicine, certainly not to non-Jews. So many of them fled, and if they came to Britain, they had to requalify. And evidently, it was quicker and cheaper to requalify in Scotland than in England. So many of the refugee doctors came to Edinburgh to requalify. They included some top doctors, psychiatrists, people like Karl Abenheimer, who was at the top of his field in psychoanalysis. Carl Bloom, who is also on this slide, was a consultant radiologist. Even it wasn't just doctors, nurses also. There was a shortage of nurses at the start of the war, which created an opportunity for refugees to enter the field, even though there were enemy aliens. And evidently, by the spring of 1940, more than 900 refugee nurses were employed in British hospitals.
So the Kindertransport from the late 1930s, when there was a rapidly deteriorating situation for Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, following the violent anti-Jewish events in Germany in 1938, which are commonly known as Kristallnacht, the UK government agreed to take in 10,000 unaccompanied children up to the age of 17 on the Kindertransport scheme. Each child had to be sponsored for about £50. The idea was that this was to cover them eventually being sent back to the country they came from after the war. Hundreds of these children came to Scotland, and many of them stayed in the Garnet Hill area. So although the government they approved the scheme, they didn't organise it, and it was other organisations who actually came together to do this. So the Central British Fund combined with Save the Children, Quakers, Jewish organisations, to rescue children through this scheme. So between 1938 and 1939, the transports brought children from Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia to Britain. So the Kindertransport children were sponsored and fostered in Scotland by Jewish and non-Jewish families, so Episcopalians, Quakers and members of the Church of Scotland. The Archive Centre has interviews and papers relating to children who came to Scotland on the Kindertransport, including passports, landing cards, different correspondence, Home Office and Red Cross papers, photographs, oral history interviews. So on the screen you can see some examples of contemporary photos of child refugees. At the bottom right there is an example of an ID card which would have been issued to a Kindertransport child when they arrived in the UK. The largest single collection relating to this period is the Dorrit M. Sim collection, and you can see Dorrit's German ID card on the left of the screen here. Dorrit Marianne Oppenheim was born in 1931 in Kassel in Germany and came to Scotland on the Kindertransport in 1939 when she was 7. Her grandfather had received an Iron Cross for services in the Red Cross in the First World War, as did her father, Hans, but this didn't help to save him from the Nazis. Unfortunately, her parents were unable to follow their daughter to Scotland, and they ended up in Theresienstadt and later perished in Auschwitz. Dorrit married the Scottish lawyer Andrew Sim in 1952 and had a family. And when she passed away in 1912, her family gifted thousands of documents, letters and papers to the Archive Centre, about 40 boxes of the items.
So, Gary told you earlier about Garnet Hill Synagogue, the home of the Heritage Centre, the Archive Centre, the oldest synagogue in Scotland. Garnet Hill congregation played a big part in helping Jewish refugees who came to Glasgow in the 1930s and 40s. And you see again the the synagogue, inside the synagogue. The document in the background is from a general meeting held in Garnet Hill Synagogue, a meeting of the congregation, December 1938. And it says, this meeting recommends that every male seat holder of the congregation agrees to contribute a minimum sum of 1 shilling and sixpence per week for the appeal committee of the Council for German Jewry, and that committee of 12 be formed to supervise the gathering of the contributions. So, congregation owned this house on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a B-listed building which the congregation had bought in the 1870s. It's an 1840s house, first occupied by Alexander Morrison of Ballinacil, the Dean of the Faculty of Procurators in Glasgow from the 1840s to 1860. Later, once he passed away and his family moved out, it was for a short time it was a boarding school in the 1860s and early 1870s. The Glasgow Hebrew congregation bought the house in the 1870s. It's the synagogue itself was built in the grounds of the original house. In 1939, as I say, the congregation owned this house and offered it to be transformed into a hostel for refugee boys who came to Scotland on the Kinder transport. And the house was refurbished and refurnished. The Jewish Echo newspaper at the time, in February 1939, said, the boys will virtually run the house themselves. They will have certain duties to perform, such as making their own beds and cleaning their own shoes, and they will appoint their own prefects, who will see that all duties are properly carried out and good conduct maintained. They will each receive 6pence a week pocket money and a 2pence halfpenny stamp for a weekly letter to their parents. So it was an organised venture to support the refugee boys who are starting to arrive. And at the Archive Centre we have the register of the hostel, and you can see on the screen a page from the register. Between 1939 and 1948, when it finally closed, over 175 refugees, mostly boys, from Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia lived in this hostel. The capacity of the hostel, I think from memory, was about 30 boys at a time, and people, they came and went. We have personal testimonies or interviews from a number of former hostel boys in our collection at the Archive Centre. Continuing the story of the boys' hostel, for many years the matron of the boys' hostel was Mrs. Irene Marchant, who had come to Scotland from Gelsenkirchen in Germany in May 1939 with her son Ernst. And you can see on the screen, on the left-hand side, we have a number of documents like this. These are German passports. Interesting number of respects. One is the swastika symbols stamped in various parts of the passport. The photograph of Irene Marchant, and underneath it says Irene Sarah Marchant. Under the Nazis, all Jewish women had to take on the middle name of Sarah, and all Jewish men had to take the middle name of Israel, and you see that on their passports. Also, in the centre of the screen, you see there's a red letter J for Jude in German, meaning Jew, and this was to flag up if you didn't know that these people were Jewish. The boys' hostel at Garnet Hill was not the only refugee hostel. There were other refugee hostels at this time in Battlefield, in Skelman in Ayrshire, Whittingham House in East Lothian, Bolton House in Mid Lothian, Ernestby House in Castle Douglas, and also in Cardross, Selkirk, and Burness and elsewhere.
So a number of refugees lived in the Garnet Hill area. For example, just down the street at 155 Hill Street, there were at least 2 flats housing refugees. This building no longer exists as it was badly damaged in the storm of 1968, but the son of a refugee couple remembered going to this address with his parents in the 1940s, and he told us that on the top floor lived a Mrs. Friedlander, and at one time she had a lodger called Gustav Schenkel, a young refugee boy born in the Sudetenland. In the flat opposite lived refugee artist Hilda Goldwag and her companion Ceci Schwarzschild, who was also a refugee from Germany. And she's seen here in the middle of the picture. Hilda is on the right and Ceci on the left in that photograph. Hilda was born in 1912 and she died in 2008, and she escaped to Scotland in 1939 from Vienna, where she had recently graduated from art school. She was assisted by the Scottish Domestic Bureau for Refugee Women. This was a combined Jewish and Quaker women's initiative, so a number of refugee women came to Scotland under this scheme, and it helped them to secure domestic work. So she worked for a Church of Scotland minister in West Linton as a domestic help. She did war work in a factory in Govan, but she was later able to return to her artistic roots, really, and use those skills. So she designed scarves, as an example of one in the bottom right. She worked as a freelance illustrator, and she painted throughout her life. The Archive Centre has got a large collection of her personal papers, her artworks and textiles. You can see here on the left a photograph of her painting a mural as a young girl, and also below that is her passport. Other refugees who lived at various times in this flat in 155 Hill Street include Paul Zunterstein. He came from Vienna. He was actually imprisoned for a time before leaving on the Kindertransport in 1939, and he would have been at the maximum age for this. So he studied and taught sculpture at Glasgow School of Art. His sculpture, Mother and Child, which you can see on the left here, and this was made for the exterior wall of a school in Milton, and it was quite controversial at the time due to the figures being nude. Hilda and Paul both had studios in this flat. Also at this address at one point were a refugee couple, the Hollanders, with their daughter. Mrs. Hollander had a business making clothes. Another refugee, Justel Huning from Czechoslovakia, went on to become a professor in psychology. So moving to the street that runs parallel to Hill Street is this building. This is at 258 Renfrew Street. It's actually a council nursery. So it's previously been used by the Young Women's Christian Association, and it was converted to a women's hostel for refugees run by the Quakers between 1940 and 1942. It had accommodation for about 15 Jewish refugees who were looked after by a matron. So one of the people who stayed in this hostel was Rosa Saccharin, and she says, "The smaller room I slept in could hold 3 to 4 beds. It was pretty small. Most of the women were working, so it was mainly in the evenings. The sitting room was quite busy. Those not working could have meals there. The person in charge was Miss Niven, and the cook was Miss Vittelschoffer." So on the photograph on the right is Rosa and her sister Betty. So they both stayed in the hostel, and this shows them being reunited with their mother in 1949. So many of the women in the hostel would have been working in domestic service as per their visas. The Scottish Domestic Bureau for Refugees was founded in August 1939 by a group of Quaker and Jewish women in Edinburgh, and that was to place refugees in domestic service around the country. So the Bureau ran a hostel in Edinburgh where young women refugees could live before placement. But in 1940, Edinburgh became a protected area, so refugees were transferred to Glasgow from Edinburgh, and that included the women who were in the hostel. So the irony is that many of these women who came on these visas were from middle schools in Germany and Austria and would have had their own servants. So now they had to get employment as cooks and housekeepers in Scottish homes, but at least it saved their lives. It's also worth mentioning that some things don't really change too much in this area. You know, along this section of Renfrew Street, there's still a lot of hostels which house refugees.
So, moving on with the tour of Garnet Hill, if you like. This is 231 Renfrew Street. This is Garnet Bank Primary School. Between 1873 and 1918, Glasgow School Board built around 75 schools across the city, and many of them looked like this. This was opened in 1905. It's on our presentation because during the period we're talking about, many of the boys from the boys' hostel attended this school, and you can see in the school admission register in 1939, there's a list of 32 refugee boys who have joined the school. On the 16th of May, the logbook of the school says, enrolled this morning 12 Jewish refugees, boys from Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia, aged 8 to 14, some speaking very little English, have therefore formed a class of them, S7. No teacher meantime. 2 days later, Miss Jessie Dempster, MA Hons, began duty this afternoon with the class of refugees. She speaks German. By October, it's the logbook is telling you that the pupils are being evacuated to Kinross. In late 1913, many of the hostel boys were evacuated to farms in the countryside, in Perthshire, Kinross, etc., where they helped with harvesting and other farm jobs.
So this image shows the Refugee Club at 350 at Sauchiehall Street. In 1941, the Glasgow Refugee Centre was formed in a vacant shop in Pitt Street. And in the next year, it moved to this location on Sauchiehall Street and became the Scottish Refugee Centre or Refugee Club. So it was on the site of what's now the Glasgow Dental Hospital and School. So the images here show it from 2 angles. You can see it was based in this detached villa, set back from the street and with a garden that slopes down to Sauchiehall Street. So it had been owned by Albert E. Pickard, who was a millionaire showman, eccentric and philanthropist who owned a lot of properties in Glasgow, including the Britannia Panopticon in Trongate. So the centre was funded by the Labour Party, the Cooperative Movement and the STUC. Janie Buchan was someone who was involved with it. Its role, it provided political debates and lectures. It also had a restaurant that served cheap continental meals. So it was a great social centre for Jewish and non-Jewish refugees. So one of the issues that is often faced by refugees is that they miss food that they were used to at home. So Ernst Fettner, a Viennese journalist, when he was speaking about the centre in 1988, says, "We came to the centre to speak German to each other, and because most of us felt lonely at first. The house was alive with left-wing ideas. There were lectures on Marxism in the canteen. We'd stay up half the night discussing what was happening in Europe and planning for the future. But we also went there to meet Scots because it was one of the few places where we could." Unfortunately, there are no formal records for the centres that we found. The information comes from things like press cuttings and personal testimony. Here on the screen, the piece of paper at the top is a kind of a membership. It's a paper that shows membership to the centre. There's an image of refugees taking part in the May Day procession in 1942. Refugees from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Norway. Also a flyer for another event, The Fate of Nations, which states that refugees from Nazi-occupied Europe were working with Scottish people in the spirit of international comradeship. One of the main groups participating in the wartime amalgamation of drama groups was the Glasgow Jewish Institute Players, and after the war the building was used by Glasgow Unity Theatre. So just down the road and round the corner from the Refugee Centre was the Scott Street Arts Centre, and this was at 7 Scott Street. So it doesn't exist anymore as an independent address, but it's part of the CCA, kind of at the side of the building. The Scott Street Arts Centre was opened by English publisher David Archer, who moved to Glasgow from London during the war after being declared unfit for military service. And he set up the Scott Street Centre in 1941 as a meeting place and a resource centre, and it was known simply as the Centre. So before the war, he ran a bookshop in London and also Parton Press, which mostly published poetry. So here there's an image of a flyer for the centre, and we're paying a small fee to join. People could borrow books, particularly poetry, drink coffee, listen to records or live music recitals, and hear talks about contemporary art, or just meet up with friends. The centre was used by Glasgow-based artists, including the two Roberts, McBride and Calhoun, J.D. Ferguson, and also the refugee artists Yankel Adler and Joseph Herman. On the right is an image, a painting by Joseph Herman called Refugees, and this was painted while he was living in Glasgow. Herman was originally from Warsaw, and he spent time in Glasgow during the period of the Art Centre, working alongside fellow Polish artist Yankel Adler, who came to Glasgow in 1941. So getting to see their work was undoubtedly something very influential for Glasgow-based artists. And they were also involved in the New Art Club, which was started by J.D. Ferguson in 1940. So the centre was only open for 18 months, but it was a really important cultural hub for Glasgow and a way for people in the city to make connection with European artists and be influenced by their work and ideas. So continuing up the hill from Scott Street, we arrive at the Glasgow School of Art. So sadly not the view you get to see of the art school at the minute. So among the refugees who taught at the School of Art, Paul Zunterstein, who we mentioned previously, studied the art school and taught there. Architect Frederick Selby, who came from Germany, was initially interned in England alongside Paul Zunterstein. Izzy Metzstein, who came from Berlin as a child on the Kindertransport. So he actually had his bar mitzvah in Garnet Hill Synagogue. He took evening classes at GSA and later became a lecturer there. He's best known for designing the iconic St. Peter's Roman Catholic Seminary at Cardress. There's a photograph here of Izzy Metzstein being presented by Princess Margaret with membership of the Royal Fine Art Commission in 1979. From 1938 to 1961, Estonian-born Jewish sculptor Benno Schatz was head of sculpture and ceramics at the art school. He came to Glasgow as an immigrant in 1931 and was a really significant figure in the art school, in the art scene at the time, and did a lot to help some of the refugee artists who'd come to the city. There's a photograph of him here sculpting, just at the top right. So he's sculpting Leib Yaffa, who's a prominent Russian-born Zionist leader in Palestine, a Hebrew poet and a newspaper editor. So in March 1939, the exhibition 20th Century German Art opened at the McClellan Galleries, which is now the McClellan Works, just along Sauchiehall Street. And this allowed the Scottish public to see some of the contemporary German artwork that had been labelled as degenerate by the Nazis. The exhibition was sponsored and published by the Saltire Society, and Benno Schatz also helped finance to promote the exhibition to raise money for the Refugee Artists Fund. Then in the winter of 1942 to 43, in the depths of the war, the Jewish community of Glasgow had a 3-week-long exhibition in the Jewish Institute in South Portland Street, which is the heart of the Jewish Gorbals, and Benno Schatz was one of the organisers. So in this exhibition were works by Pizarro, Chagall, Modigliani, Soutine, pieces by Max Lieberman, Jacob Epstein, Alfred Wallmark, David Bomberg, Mark Gettler and Manny Katz, as well as local immigrant and refugee artists such as Benno Schatz, Joseph Herman, Yankel Adler. There's a photograph here of the cover of the exhibition, and Benno Schatz wrote in the catalogue, "Today, when on the continent of Europe, Jewish life and culture is being systematically and brutally uprooted and destroyed, there is an urgent necessity for Jews elsewhere to demonstrate their faith in themselves and their future. It is for them to build afresh, to build stronger and better in the certain knowledge that given faith, no power on earth can destroy the work of the Spirit."
So a number of refugees came to Scotland after the end of the Second World War as survivors of concentration camps. A group of 732 young Holocaust survivors known as the Boys were brought to the UK after the war from Prague. The Central British Fund arranged accommodation and care for them in a hostel in Windermere, and then they were dispersed around the country, including Darleith House in Cardross. These were boys who had had survived the camps. Judith Rosenberg, you can see her wedding photo at the top of the slide, survived Auschwitz, came to Scotland. Martin Anson and Isaac Milner were both in Dachau concentration camp. Chaim Olmer from Silesia was in a number of camps. He came to Dartmouth House and was fostered in Glasgow and trained in Scotland to be a dentist. Ernest Levy from Bratislava was in a number of camps. He, after the war, went to Budapest, and in 1961 he came to Glasgow and became a cantor in one of the main synagogues. Marianne Grant was born in Prague. She was an artist. She survived a number of camps, and her artwork, including illustrations of what she saw in the camps, is available to see at Calvin Grove Art Gallery. So, refugees in the 1930s and 40s contributed to Scotland in many different ways. Many lived quietly, working and bringing up families. A significant number made an important contribution to Scottish society in the areas of art and architecture, academia, business, economy, employment, medicine, psychology and psychotherapy. Kate Herman, for example, from Germany, was Scotland's first female consultant neurologist. Refugees came to play a major role in Edinburgh's cultural life. Austrian Jews Rudolf Bing and composer Hans Gall were instrumental in establishing the Edinburgh Festival in 1947. A number of refugees were allowed into Scotland to set up businesses and provide employment. The Friedlander family had a silk printing business in Vienna. After the Anschluss in 1938, some of the family managed to get out of Austria. They came to Hillington in Glasgow, where they set up a textile printing factory, later employing other refugees. The Kidney factory was established by Willy Goldschmidt, who fled from Nazi Germany, and he re-established his children's clothing factory in the East End of Glasgow. There's a display again of artefacts from his factory at Calvin Grove Museum. And Jack Tiefenbrunn, originally from Krakow, was a refugee from Vienna in 1939. He worked for a knitwear manufacturer in Scotland and then set up the textile engineering company, later Castle Precision Limited. An offshoot in 1973 became Lynn Hi-Fi, which manufactures high-end hi-fi and home entertainment equipment. So, the story of Jewish refugee immigration to Scotland in the 30s and 40s is a relatively good story. These refugees who came here escaped the hell of Nazi Europe, and they found a safe haven in Scotland and made a new life here. A number of them settled in Glasgow and in Scotland. Others, after the war, moved to other parts of the world. But this shows you, you always think of refugees in a certain sort of like, you have a certain picture in your mind of refugees. These are former refugees in the late 1940s, socialising together at a New Year party. And, you know, they look, to all intents and purposes, they look like normal people, whatever that means, you know. But they all had stories of who they had lost and what they had left behind.
I'll just finish up with some information about where you can find out more about this time period. So if you have any research inquiries, you can contact the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre. If you'd like to visit the building of Garnet Hill Synagogue, we have weekly guided tours which you can book on our website, usually on a Tuesday and Thursday, although we have got a Sunday tour coming up in November. And the Archives Centre also have regular Sunday open days. There's a self-guided walking trail of the Garnet Hill area. We actually have some of the leaflets here, and so this highlights the sites that we've been talking about, so you can you know, walk around that yourself, kind of a self-guided thing. You can also download information from the Heritage Centre website. There's a dedicated resource for studying this time period, the Scottish Holocaust Era Study Centre. So this looks specifically at the stories of Jewish refugees who came to Scotland, their experiences and family history, their journey, how they were received in Scotland, and their contribution in many different areas. It provides access to the rapidly growing refugee-era collections of the Archive Centre. This display we have is called Scotland a Sanctuary, and it looks at that period of 1933 to 1945-6, including a timeline of events in Scotland, Nazi Germany and occupied Europe, looking at what was happening here, what was happening there. Other panels reveal the response to refugees in different areas, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Ayrshire, telling some stories of the Holocaust survivors who came to Scotland. We have hands-on learning kits for school children, which are based on the experiences of those refugees who found sanctuary in Scotland. A specialist library of over 200 reference books on the Holocaust, refugee autobiographies, biographies, digital resources. There's a catalogue of over 3,000 key documents, which is digitised, that you can access on the premises, as well as digital access to the Glasgow Jewish Echo between 1928 and 1950. So this is a resource that's used by school pupils, university students and researchers throughout the year. I'll finish off just by showing our contact details. So just for any guided tours or school visits, it's the Heritage Centre. For any research inquiries and archive collection visits, you can contact the Scottish Jewish Archive Centre. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kerry and Harvey. We have a lot of time for questions, if anyone would like.
Yeah. Hold on, I'll bring the mic to you. With the hand.
It'd be interesting, but you mentioned that the Jewish women refugees were brought across the line into Glasgow, and you described that you were as a protected area. What did that mean?
So I didn't catch the last bit.
You described Edinburgh as a protected area.
So Edinburgh was a protected area. There were areas of the UK, certainly in Scotland, Edinburgh was one of the main ones, which were called protected areas. That meant that they were sort of crucial in terms of either defence or commerce, industry, whatever. And people were paranoid. People were really anxious about Germans, what they thought might be German spies in their midst. Churchill famously said, "Call it the lot." And at a certain point, early in the war, all adult male foreign nationals, by foreign nationals specifically, I'm talking about German, Italian nationals, Austrians, they were interned in places like the Isle of Man, and the refugees, the Jewish refugees, others presumably, who had arrived in Edinburgh prior to that were shipped out of Edinburgh. Most of them came to Glasgow and some went to other parts of Scotland, but they were, so they called this a protected area.
Yeah, I know that you are concentrating on refugees, but you know, pre and during the Second World War, what about people who were all Jewish people who were also refugees who fled the pogroms, etc.? You include stuff about that.
Yeah, so this is talks specifically about the refugee period. The Archive Centre, as I said, is looking at the experience of Jewish people in Scotland over the past 200 years, and one of the main themes of our collections is immigration, and the biggest period of immigration was from the 1880s to the First World War, when many thousands of Jews came from Eastern Europe and from the Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, etc., and settled in Glasgow. Many of them were on their way to America. Many of them stayed here for a short time and then went to America. They came for each wave of immigration came for sort of slightly different reasons. those who came in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s were coming because of poverty and persecution, and in some areas pogroms in Eastern Europe, and they were going westwards, and that included Glasgow, which was on the way to America. The refugees who came in the 30s, 40s and 50s, they obviously came because of Nazi persecution. Their plight was much more immediate, I would say.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. One question I had is, we've seen a lot of examples of the Jewish population being welcomed into Scotland, and like you said, it's a really great story. In terms of, say, like the working class view on the Jewish population, what was their thoughts towards the Jewish refugees who arrived?
Well, I think that certainly for those who came in the 30s and 40s, I think generally speaking they were well received. That there was this anxiety about German spies in the midst, so there would have been some people who were anxious, but you didn't see any sort of like massive demonstrations against Jewish immigration. You can't help, when you talk about this period, you can't help thinking about present day and refugees in other countries in the last few years, and Scotland is quite, I thought, generally speaking, quite a tolerant place. Some people explain this because people are more concerned about whether, in the west of Scotland, for instance, about whether you're Catholic or Protestant, That's sort of one of the main dynamics. But the period from the 1880s onwards, with the immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, there was a little bit of anti-Semitism, but nothing like what we were used to on the continent. So it was just a totally different league.
I would add as well, if you think about one of the main areas that came at that time where they were living in the Gorbals, which was quite a diverse area for immigration in terms of there were immigrants from other countries coming as well, like Irish immigrants. And we do have stories about, for example, people from other religious backgrounds, like helping out the Jewish families, like on Shabbat when they're not supposed to work or light fires or do that kind of thing. So, I'm not saying that things were perfect and there were no arguments, but there are definitely examples of different communities, if you're, especially working class communities, perhaps working together and living alongside each other.
Yeah, I should say also that a large number of the Kindertransport children who came were taken in and fostered by non-Jewish families all around Scotland, especially in places where there are no Jewish communities, and we're still hearing stories about Jewish refugee children who were taken in by non-Jewish families. And I should say that if anybody has any information, material, photographs, documents, whatever, about this period that are relevant to what we're doing, we'd be happy to talk to you. And and if your families, for instance, taking a refugee, we'd be interested in that as well.
Two questions. Just one about Friday in Scott's Art Centre over the last week and months doing that, and why in particular Scotland became the sort of area that Jewish refugees sort of settles.
In relation to the Art Centre, I don't really know a huge amount about it. I actually just kind of stumbled across it while doing some internet research. But I know that there's in the Ben Urey Gallery in London, the curators there have done a little bit of research, and that was where I got the image of the flyer. But it was so short-lived. But I think it was just, I know the person that set it up, they didn't stay in Glasgow, so I don't know if they just kind of were passing through and they set it up, and it's just like one of these short-lived ventures. I think in terms of why it was such a hub, basically it was really based around the synagogue which was there, and then we had the boys' hostel, you've got the women's hostel, which are like literally either side of it, and then the refugee centre was so nearby. I don't know how they chose that particular venue, but
Partly because it's a city centre, refugees are more likely to be in the centre, partly because the Garnet Hill congregation, which was by no means the only Jewish congregation in Glasgow, it was just the oldest, there were a number of others, but because they were so proactive in helping refugees, and because of the fact that two hostels, as you say, and also the Scottish Refugee Centre in Circuit Hall Street, again, made sense for it to be in the city centre. So, I mean, and Garnet Hill is quite a multicultural area right to this day. That, you know, if you look at the history of Garnet Hill, the Jesuits arrived in the 1850s or 1860s and set up St Aloysius Church and school, and then the Jewish community arrived in the 1870s and set up Garnet Hill Synagogue, and since then the Asian communities, Chinese, so multicultural area. Yeah.
I had a question about the background context of Jewish immigration refugees. You said, if I'm not mistaken, about 2,500 refugees during the Third World War. I was wondering if there's a reason for this number, if it was a quota, if they were people trying to make it to southern goods, or they were stopped, or so it did look like it would say this number.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any particular quota. I think it was partly to do with resources, because and a lot of this was being done on the hoof, if you like, you know, because like nowadays with Ukrainians and whatever, you don't always get a lot of notice that all these refugees are coming. So the refugees that are arriving in somewhere like Harwich down south, and very quickly they've got to be farmed out across the country, and the refugees and the kinder transport had to be sponsored. So it's families who were putting up money for that.
Because the number of for the whole kinder transport in the UK is 10,000, so I think there's not, you know, exact records either of people that came to Scotland. So I think some of these are just, you know, an estimation, and also to bear in mind that that was approved by the government, but the organisation all came from basically grassroots organisations as well. So I suppose it, you know, the numbers just depended on, you know, the level of organisation and the people that could get involved. It wasn't, you know, a kind of and many official interference.
Out of the 10,000 who came to kinder transport, it's been estimated that 800 came to Scotland. Again, sort of like I think proportionately, you know, Scotland did quite well here, and yeah.
Hi, I've just got a question about Battlefield. I used to live next to the Falk Road synagogue.
Yes.
And you mentioned the boys' hostel there, Battlefield. Just curious as to who it was, because also there was a huge Jewish community. The synagogue's gone, our Government Hill synagogue's gone. Just curious as to who it was.
So to summarise, the Jewish community has, like many immigrant groups, has moved across the city as it became more established. By the early 1900s, there was a Jewish community in the Battlefield area. They opened a synagogue. They built a new synagogue in the 1920s, which was in Fallock Road, and for many years that was a very sort of busy Jewish area with Jewish shops, etc. In Millbury Road, quite nearby, right about the First World War, a Jewish orphanage was set up. It moved to bigger premises in Sinclair Drive, which is now a nursery next to the library. That was the building on that site was made into the Jewish orphanage, and during in the late 30s and during the war, it housed some refugees, and then after the war, 1950s, I think, the building was demolished. The orphanage closed after the war, In the 1950s, the building was demolished and a Jewish youth club was built, which is now a nursery. The Jewish community has, by and large, moved away from that area and moved further south to the sort of government areas. Jewish community in Scotland is much smaller than it used to be. It's shrinking fast.
Did you have a question?
I just have a following question. You mentioned fostering the kingdom.
Yes.
So was there an active program of adoption for the children? And if they were adopted, did they change their names? Was it heritage place?
I'm not aware of an active program of adoption. There were a number of cases where children came very young and were looked after by Scottish families, Jewish and non-Jewish, and some of them were fortunate enough that at least one of the parents survived or family members, and there are instances where people came after the war to, in effect, reclaim their children, and the children sometimes have been too young to even sort of recognise them. So sad stories. Not all the stories are sad, some of them had a happy ending, this kind of thing. A number of the refugees, a number of the children moved away to England or America or elsewhere and were reunited sometimes with family members. But and some changed their names. A number of Jewish children were adopted by Christian families and in effect brought up as Christians and adopted Christianity. That happened also. So there was no one size fits all, I would say.
Yeah, in the example of the Dorrit Sim collection that we mentioned, so when she stayed on after the war and she continued living with the adopted family that she'd come to first of all, and they were quite religious, they were a Christian family, and she ended up being baptised into the Church of Scotland. But I think she always felt that her Jewish roots were important to her, and it was really it was a really important thing to her that, you know, her objects came to the Heritage Centre, the Archive Centre, and that her family continued to talk about that. So we do actually have a letter that her, you know, when her parents were still trying to escape, they had sent a letter to her adopted family, and they were saying, you know, in the letter, in reply to your question about her education, so obviously her adopted parents had said, you know, how do you want us to raise her? They just said, we're not Orthodox, you know, we're good people, we love God in all those ways, and they were kind of saying it's not particularly important to us, we just want her to be safe and to be happy. But obviously, you know, she did keep some kind of connection with her Jewish roots despite being baptized in the church.
Many of the majority of the refugees were not fully practicing Jews, but many of them came to very assimilated families in Berlin and Vienna and this kind of thing, but they were picked out with Nazi society, Nazi regime, because they were Jewish, and not necessarily what we would, the Jewish community would consider Jewish, because many of them had one Jewish grandparent and didn't really think of themselves as Jewish, you know. So it's not that they were all fully practicing Jews and were being brought up as Christians. You know, many of them had no, didn't live so much in the real Jewish experience.
I would also add as well, maybe some of the children who might have come to Glasgow would probably have had, it would be easier for them to be more connected to, you know, Jewish roots because it was a kind of a thriving community at the time. It probably was different. Maybe some of the children who went to areas where there wasn't a Jewish community that were more remote or something like that. So, you know, in Glasgow there was actually a community that they might have been able to connect with that wanted to.
Okay, we are out of time. Thank you everyone who asked questions. It was a great discussion. And please join me. Thank you everyone for coming. There is another talk in this space starting at 7:30, decarbonizing house by house by the local home. If you would like to join us, there are still spaces. You just hang about and we'll admit you. There's loads happening still this week for those open days, but most of the program is happening Friday to Sunday, so please do get on the website and get into the building this weekend. Thank you for coming.
I'm going to take leaflets if you would like.